Are here in chapter 14, and most people look at it in reference to the fall of Satan from heaven. And I think, of course, we know with prophecy there's always a twofold meaning, or typically always a twofold meaning. And so we see that this has meaning for Isaiah's day and time, although it was a point that would be in the future of Isaiah, but then Isaiah is also looking way into the future as well. So let's start in verse 1 of chapter 14. It says, "For the Lord will have compassion on Jacob, and will again choose Israel, and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join with them, and will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. And the peoples will take them and bring them to their place, and the house of Israel will possess them in the Lord's land as male and female slaves. They will take captive those who were their captors, and rule over those who oppress them. When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. The whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypresses rejoice at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. All of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. The sound of your harps. Maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. How you are fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of dawn. How you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, who did not let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out away from the grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword who go down to the stones of the pit like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial because you have destroyed your land. You have slain your people. May the offspring of evildoers nevermore be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. And I will make it a possession of the hedgehog, the pools of water, and I will sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. Verse 24, then the Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be, and as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land, and on my mountains trample him underfoot. And his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? In the year that King Ahaz died, came this oracle, rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying, fiery serpent. And the firstborn of the poor will graze, and the needy lie down in safety, but I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you. For smoke comes out of the north, and there is no straggler in his ranks. What will one answer the messengers of the nations? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. And we're going to go back. There's a couple of different, actually 3 different groups of people that are addressed in this chapter. You have the Babylonians, you have the Assyrians, and you have the Philistines. So each of them have a little bit different, but there is something that they have in common. All of them will face judgment from God because, and they were used actually, or allowed, I should say, they were allowed to bring judgment upon Judah in different points in time. But then because their heart was not in the right place of doing this, they weren't actually obeying God, they weren't following Him in all that they'd done, God then brought judgment upon them. And so we find that God is warning them here and telling them what's going to occur. Well, let's go back to the beginning of the chapter and let's kind of start and we'll walk through it a little bit. In question 1, what does verse 1 tell us will happen at some point in the future from when Isaiah wrote this? So verse 1, for the Lord will have compassion on Jacob and will again choose Israel and will set them in their own land, and sojourners will join with them, will attach themselves to the house of Jacob. So what do we find that God is telling Isaiah here in chapter 1?
Bring the Jews back to their country.
Bring what now?
The Jews back.
Okay. They will be, if we want to use the word restored, at some point in time. They will not be captive for the rest of their life, but they will be restored.
They're still special.
They are still special. He still has a special place for them in his eyes, if you want to call it that. What else do we see? And we might specify here too, I know he's saying Israel in terms of the people of that day and time, Israel. But as we think forward in time, not just to the time that Isaiah is speaking this, but we think forward in time, does Israel refer to just Jewish people? No, it doesn't. And we get that because if you read on down, the next portion of that question is, who are the sojourners? He actually prophesies here that sojourners will join with them. Now, who are the sojourners? Yeah, thankfully us, right? I mean, gratefully, God did not just say it's only Jews, but He said it is going to be sojourners joining together with as well. So we must be thankful for that because it does provide us the avenue. And it was not only after, sometimes we get this kind of, we think it was only after the New Testament church started and Paul goes out that he starts ministering to the Gentiles. The Gentiles were ministered to before that as well. Old Testament times, they were ministered to also and had the ability to actually join and become Jewish at that point in time, become Jewish. You actually find Rahab did that. She became part of the Israelites. Rahab's actually one of the ancestors, earthly ancestors of Jesus Christ. So we find that in his lineage here on earth. Anything else from verse 1 that we see? And depending on your, compassion. That was where I was going. I was fixing to count the words. He had compassion. Isn't that an important thing for us to note? That God has compassion. We've talked about this, I think, a few times, but we see it on display in Christ when a couple different times He actually weeps or mourns. You know, Lazarus we've talked about, when he looks out over Jerusalem, we see him weep as well. It's His compassion being displayed through His emotions. But it's important for us to realize that God has compassion because as we are supposed to be as much like Christ as we can be, we too should have compassion as well for those around us. Doesn't mean that we have everything right, but it does mean that we should have compassion for those even that are doing what we might say terrible things in life. All right, anything else on question 1 or verse 1?
Another one that was mentioned that you said Gentile would have been Naomi,
Right, Naomi.
Ruth's daughter-in-law.
Yep. All right, question 2 then. From verse 4, what country or group of people or idealistic thought is being addressed in these verses? So if you look down to verse 4, it says, you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, how the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. So obviously, in that day and time, Babylon was a country that, or a power, I should say, that was against Judah, that was giving all kinds of problems to God's people. We want to term them that way. But is that the only thing that Isaiah is speaking about here as he brings up this king of Babylon? Or is he addressing something much deeper than just, or far beyond just this group of people that were in power at that moment in time?
Probably all the way down through history, the different groups that were what you call anti-Christ.
Mm-hmm.
Adolf Hitler, Jim Jones, all
David Koresh.
Tom, all those leaders like that.
It's an interesting concept that is brought out, and I say interesting, it's a truthful concept that's brought out. And it's this Babylonian mindset that every evil empire or country or leader has had from actually the fall of Adam and Eve. It began there. And it's this idea or this concept of what we're going to look at when we get over to verse 13, 14. And it's this pride that permeates throughout all of humanity. And it is a pridefulness that God cannot stand. And so when we look in verse 4, really if you back up to verse 3, it says, when the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve. Now he's speaking to his people, Judah, at this point in time. You will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon, how the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. In other words, at some point in time, this king of Babylon will no longer be able to oppress you, but you will actually be able to stand and say, what are you doing now? Because you're not affecting me anymore. Not that we will, but we'll be able to do that. You find that throughout every evil empire along the way, that at some point they fell. At some point they were no more. There is no evil empire that's still in power from the time of Isaiah. They have all fell. And there have been others that have risen, but they have also fell as well. And so Isaiah looks ahead. Now he's looking at his point in time. He's looking still into the future when he's talking about current, because he's saying at some point, Judah, you're going to be able to say to the king of Babylon, you're not going to affect me anymore. Now that had not happened yet, so it was into the future. But he's also looking way into the future, to the time of Christ's return, when this whole concept of Babylon will be overthrown. And that's this desire to be like God, or to be as God is. So look at question 3 from verse 9. What happens in Sheol when this ruler has fallen? So skip down to verse 9. It says, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. Now this is addressing this ruler of Babylon. Now again, notice Isaiah doesn't put a name to this. Like there are are times here where we find him call out King Ahaz. Right? King Ahaz was not a great guy, but he's not identifying a name here, which I think is really important because he's identifying individuals that fit this category. And so he says, Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. Now he's talking about meeting the king of Babylon, which physically would have actually been the king of Babylon, but also would be any king that fits into this idealistic thought of, I'm going to be as God. Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come. It rouses the shades to greet you. All who were leaders of the earth, it raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. And in verse 10, all of them will answer and say to you, you too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. This is one of the reasons that we feel as though this is speaking to an ongoing list of people that fit this king of Babylon status, is because when you look at what verse 9 and 10 show us, is that there's a group of people waiting to receive the next king of Babylon that falls, and they all rise up and say this, you too have become just as weak as we are. In other words, at one point on earth, they had great power, but then they fell, and no longer do they have any power. And so these guys, if you could imagine this, just kind of a mental picture, I'm not saying this is the way it's going to happen, just for us to think about it a little bit though, mentally. Let's imagine that there's a room somewhere, and the king of Babylon, once he is removed from power, dies and goes to Sheol or hell. So they go into this room. Sitting in this room is every other individual that at one point was an evil empire, the ruler of that evil empire, and they're all sitting in there with nothing to do, but they have no power, they have no strength, they have no authority over anyone. And so this new king of Babylon that has just fell walks into the room. All these other guys stand up and say, come on in. You've realized you're just as weak as what we finally realized we were. And they have nothing to do except be tormented, which is what will actually occur. And so this is saying everyone at some point realizes that they are not going to be like God. You look at question 4, what event in life is the greatest leveler among people? There's a lot of different events that we have in life. There's obviously our beginning, our birth, and then you have, as you know, the way our society is structured, you have this time that you go off to school, you have this time you graduate school, you have this time that you enter into the workforce, and you have this time of retirement, and you have this time of becoming grandparents or parents or whatever it may be, all these different kind of milestones along in life. But there's one event that levels us with every other person. What is that event? Death. At death, we become no greater and no less than anyone else, but we are equal. And so when we look at what's happened here at the death of this king of Babylon, then he realizes that he or she realizes that they are nothing greater than anyone else. Even though on earth they've demanded power, or they've demanded authority, or they've demanded individuals to serve them, at death they will realize all of that is gone. It is no more.
These kings that make themselves to be like God, they are God in their eyes,
Right.
and want to be before their people. But then there in verse 9 says, hell from beneath is moved for thee to meet thee at thy coming.
Yeah,
This is what he's telling, this is what you've got to look forward to.
that's right.
You're not no king, you're not going to be God. Hell's waiting for you.
Yep. Yeah, and there's others that have played their role before, that are going to be there to greet them and say, you're just as weak as what we were.
How about followers and supporters of such person?
You know, he's really addressing the leader here, is what he's addressing. But I would imagine those that helped them into power would probably fall under the same category. Now, individuals that were deceived, I don't know. I mean, the thing we know is that unless they acknowledge Jesus Christ as their personal Savior, then they're not entering in and hearing, "Well done, thy good and faithful servant." But that gets into, are there different punishments for different people, for different, and I don't know the answer to that one. But what we do find him addressing here is actually the leaders of that, or leader of that.
Leaders have to answer for all the people they've led astray.
Higher accountability, yeah. That's true in teachers. It's true in what we would term our today, like pastors, Sunday school teachers, all those that have any kind of authority. Parents, grandparents that have authority over young ones. I would even say school teachers to some degree as well, because they have a responsibility for what they're teaching. All right, question 5 then, from verse 12. What do we learn from verse 12? How you are fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of dawn, how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. What do we learn from verse 12?
The angel Lucifer was cast from heaven, and we know as Satan, or the old devil himself, because he thought he was great as God or greater.
It is the passage where we really get that thought that's what occurred, and no one's disproving it, so we might as well, go with it. How you have fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of dawn. So we have the implication that at one point, in order to fall from something, you had to once be there, right? And when we, and this is where it gets into a little bit of our view of end of time kind of, and what's going on now, but is Satan allowed in heaven now?
He's allowed in the presence of God.
How do we know that?
Over in Job,
Yeah.
when the devil contended with God. And, but I always thought it was interesting what God said to Job too. Where were you when I laid the foundation? Same thing with Satan. Where were you when I laid this out?
Mm. We talk about heaven today, and sometimes in our mind we think about heaven today being the same as final heaven. And I'm not sure that it is, because we also read that there will be a new heaven, new earth that will be remade or created, which seems to point to a time in the future when that will occur. And if that's the case, at that point, Satan will not, because he will be thrown into the bottomless pit at that point. Until then, though, if we go off the Job passage, then it appears that Satan has to give a report to God on what he has done. Like God calls him in and says, "Where you been? What have you been doing?" kind of thing. And it appears that he has to give an account for what he has been doing, because if you remember that Job passage, he says, "I've been going to and fro over the face of the earth." So when we look here at verse 12, how does this somewhat fit then into that idea or that thought? Because in verse 12 says, "How you are fallen from heaven, O Daystar, son of dawn." So how, if he still, let's assume that the Job passage still holds true going forward from Job, even till today, and until Christ returns and new heaven, new earth is created. If that's the case, then how does this passage line up with that? Because it says, how you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. So how would those two things line up? Because if he's fallen from it, seems to imply that he's not there, right? But then we read Job, and we see that he stands in front of or in the presence of God and gives this report.
Where do they meet at? Presence of God. When he stands in the presence of God, where are they at?
Well, from other passages, it seems as though that God resides in his throne room. It seems.
Because God could meet anywhere. He doesn't, Satan wouldn't have to go to heaven to go face to face with God.
Correct.
And I still think that he does meet with God because God has control over what Satan does. And he has his hand on his people, and his people, Satan can only do so much to God's people, whatever God allows. It's just like with Job, don't take his life.
Right. There's limits on
There's
what.
limits, so and Satan's gonna push them limits if he gets the chance, so God's gonna have to line him out and say, no, you can't do this or that.
In Job, it says, now there was a day when the sons of God came to present themselves before the Lord. So it doesn't really say, but most indications we see in other texts is that he's in his throne room. Now, whether it's what now?
Too much almost to wrap your mind around. There may be some scholars that go, I get every bit of that, but I don't. So.
Should have had a V8 this morning, right?
You know what I mean?
I do.
About Satan being able to be in the presence of God, still
Right.
yet after he's banished. In Sunday school, we're all taught he's banished from heaven. So you think, okay, well, that's over. No, well, evidently not.
All right. Yeah, you wouldn't want to walk into a kindergarten class and start talking about this necessarily, because it does lead to some
But
deeper
doesn't it say
thought.
God does not look upon sin?
Why don't you see if you can find it?
Why do you do this to me?
Because just like when your parents used to say, well, go look it up in the encyclopedia.
You talking about looking upon Satan?
Looking upon sin. I thought it says that he cannot look upon sin.
But you're saying you can't look upon Satan either.
Right. So,
This conversation can be just like your conversation with God right now.
Well, apparently at the time of Job, God could, right?
yeah. I'll do some studying on that.
So, what if this statement in verse 12 is more of not a location, but a concept? So instead of he's fallen from a place, he's actually fallen from what we might term today as a believer. Does that make sense a little bit? So before he did respect, love, honor God, maybe at some point, but now he's fallen from that. We sometimes refer to it as falling from grace, maybe. What if this is speaking to that concept? Because we have to acknowledge that in Job, Satan stood before God, wherever that may have been. He stood before him, as well as others did, because it seems that all had to come and do that. So, and that sons of God, by the way, seems to represent angels. So Satan and angels stood before God. So if we're talking here in verse 12 from more of the concept of he fell from serving and worshiping God instead of from the place heaven, then we can make this line up, right? Because now we're not saying he's no longer allowed in heaven. Now we're saying that his desire to worship is not in line with what heaven will be. Does that make sense? We all should have had a V8 this morning, probably.
My experience is that, those that decide to lean to the evil side, prefer not to be in the presence of those in authority. So.
Right.
That doesn't mean those in authority can't call you up here.
That's right. It does show us, that Job passage does show us that he is still subjected to God, or a subject of God, however you want to say that. God still has authority over.
Satan's no different than the lost person out here that rejects Jesus Christ. That's exactly what Satan did. So lost people that reject Jesus Christ are going to be in the same boat.
But they can still be redeemed if
Yeah.
they ask forgiveness.
Right.
Yeah, which does separate.
That separates them right there.
And it does seem that Satan has he has the ability to do things that, I'm going to say a normal lost person maybe can't do. He has the ability to deceive in a way that is much greater than maybe any human was ever able to do. We're told not to take lightly the evil one, that he's wise as a serpent, or crafty as a serpent. I get that mixed up. Crafty as a serpent. I forget it. But it seems as though he is very good at what he does, which is to deceive. And we know that. I mean, we see that happen even today in different forms. So let's go on with this, and let's not necessarily get stuck in the idea of he's cast out of a place, but he's cast out of his mindset is no longer in line with worshiping God.
He was cast out, we call it a position.
Yeah,
He was created to be an angel, a servant of God, like the angel Gabriel.
that's right.
But
Actually-
by his own doing, his own decisions, then he was cast out of this position.
Right. And he was actually, we were told in other places that he was the most beautiful of angels as well. So he wasn't neglected by any means by God in creation.
He wasn't the only one cast out, too. A lot of
It's a third of heaven that fell with. Yeah. Which means that he deceived a lot of people then, even. A lot of angels, not people. Okay, question 6 then. What are the I will statements starting in verse 13? So keep in mind now, we are still talking about King of Babylon here from Isaiah's day and time and perspective. But we're also looking ahead to a future point in time as well, future for us point in time. So in verse 13, he says, you said in your heart. This is why we've got to think about this more than just a location, but we've got to think about it in terms of who Satan desired to serve. You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven above the stars of God. I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I will ascend above the heights of the clouds. I will make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol. So let's talk about just the 5 I will statements there. First one is found verse 13, and it is what? I will ascend to heaven. And now, again, if he was in heaven, how could he ascend to heaven? Does that make sense? So the location thing is kind of hard for us to say, yes, it's a location. But when you think about it in a mindset or a servant role, then it does make more sense by putting Scripture together. So I will ascend to heaven. In other words, he wanted to be in the place of God. The second one, I will set my throne on high, wanting an authority role or position more than maybe what he even had. The third, I will sit on the Mount of Assembly in the far reaches of the north. The Mount of Assembly would imply that there would be people that would gather together to worship. So, in other words, he desires the worship that God receives.
That's also where the Babylonian gods gathered.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. Again, going back, this is a twofold kind of thing. So you're looking at modern day, Judah and Babylonian, and then you're looking ahead too. Yep. Verse 14, then I will send above the heights of the clouds, and I will make myself like the Most High. Which is probably, all of those are condemning statements, let me say. But if you look at the very last one, I will make myself like the Most High. In other words, that kind of sums up all of the other four in the concept of, I want to be God. Now, there were kingdoms throughout our history that have put people in these type places. You look at the Roman Empire and their Caesars, they actually made to be a god. Now, they considered them a god. They worshiped them. So you can see how those empires would fall into this category very easily, as well as many of the others. So question 7 then, instead of accomplishing all of these confident I will statements that we just read, which is what was the desire of the individual. If you look at every evil empire that Satan may have encouraged or assisted throughout time, probably fall within, there's probably one of these I will statements that probably described them in some way. So instead of accomplishing the I will statements, what happens to them as according to verse 15?
Sent to hell.
Yeah, they're going to die. Sent to hell, but they're going to die. I mean, they're going to be brought down to Sheol, place of death. And they will be brought level with everyone else. So, you know, we look today and we see these individuals that are very prideful, very confident. And by the way, it doesn't necessarily have to be a ruler or leader of an evil empire either. Now we're talking about, because he's talking about Babylon here, King of Babylon, he is talking about a enemy of the enemy of Judah, which was an empire at that point in time, or a powerful group of people. But it doesn't have to be that. This can be a personal thing too. And you find individuals that maybe are leaders of companies that can be this way. Maybe that are just leaders of certain people that take on this persona and can fit this just the same as the leader of an evil empire can. But death will even us all out. All right, then question 8 from verse 14, what do we find to be the desire of the fallen one? We already talked about that. I will make myself like the Most High. That was the desire. I want to be like God. Now, you know, we sometimes talk about that we want to be more like Christ. And when we say that, hopefully, and I believe all of our mind says, is not that we want to be like God. We want to be God and get the glory that God deserves. Our statement by that is we want to act as Christ acted. We want to point glory to God the Father, not be like Him in authority type relationship. Now, the problem with that is when we talk to people that are not in church or people that have no religious understanding, it can come across as we want to be like in the way that it's talking about here, like God. So we have to be careful what audience we have of how we communicate things, because they are misinterpreted. And I think y'all know we are living in more of a unchurched population now than we have in a long time. And therefore we have to make sure that the community that we're in or the people we're around, when we make statements, not only this, but other statements, that they understand what we're talking about when we say that.
Brooklyn was over Sunday, and she was talking about when she was in Florida. She said there's people that had never even heard of Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to believe, but she said we run into people that never heard of Jesus.
There was someone here locally, I forgot who it was now, that actually told me they had run across a child here in town that didn't know who Jesus was. So,
That's what she was telling us.
yeah. It's, even in my mind, sometimes like thinking about Florida or New York or California or something like that, I can say, yeah, I can see where they don't. But you think about Pocahontas and you think everybody here's heard or knows who Jesus is, but that's not the case anymore. And so we have to realize we're living in a post-Christian environment is what we're living in, which I'm not sure if we ever were a truly Christian environment, but we were more Christian than what we are now.
Well, the longer it gets, the more scarier it gets.
Unless you got full faith and confidence in God.
Yeah.
And then we can sit back and say, what can man do to us? Can't harm the soul. All they can do is the physical body.
Well, I think the longer it gets, the more prideful we see.
Society. Yeah. Well, it's being promoted through athletics, not only athletics, even music industry promotes pride as well, and even different lifestyles. What's the month of June called? Pride Month. It's a lifestyle, and we're proud of it. We're not, but so it's being promoted. So we should think that in the years to come, however long it may be, 5, 10, whatever, that we're going to see pride being more of an issue even than what it is now, because it's being promoted very heavily. All right. Look at question 9 then, in verses 22 through 23. So we kind of skip into a different group of people at this point. No, I'm sorry, not yet. Verses 22 through 23, what does God say will happen to Babylon? So verse 22 says, I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts, and will cut off from Babylon name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. So what does God say will happen to Babylon? Obviously, in the very beginning of the verse, he says, I'll rise up against them. But after that, what's the end result of this? Yeah, turn to a wasteland. There will be no more. Which, when you think about Babylon itself, that's what's occurred. You think about going into the future, and if this is speaking to the time of Christ's return, then this king of Babylon concept, Antichrist type view, will be no more. They'll be bound, cast into lake of fire. So it will no longer exist either. So you have that twofold meaning again being declared here. But you also find it like throughout time, and you find that the Hitlers of the world, no longer are they in power, no longer is a descendant of his in power either. So you see this being proclaimed throughout. But for Isaiah's day and time, again, this would have been an encouragement to Judah because they were being persecuted by Judah. They were going to become captive to the Babylonian Empire. But at some point, God's saying, it will be no more. Just the same as he promised to Abraham that he would bring his descendants back to the land and give them, and he did. We find that God is promising the people of Judah at this point that at some point Babylon will no longer be their captors, but they will, Babylon will be wiped out.
In essence, he's cleaning the land when he says he sweeps it.
Right. Cleaning the land, purging, we might call it that as well. Very good. All right. And then skipping down 24, 25, we do find him speaking now to the group, the Assyrians. And what do we learn from verses 24, 25? It says, the Lord of hosts has sworn, as I have planned, so shall it be. And as I have purposed, so shall it stand, that I will break the Assyrian in my land and on my mountains, trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them, and his burden from their shoulder. So what do we learn from those two verses? We're talking about a different group of people now, right? Were the Assyrians friends to people of Judah?
Friends of Babylon.
Yeah, they were not friends to people of Judah either. So this would have been another enemy of, quote, God's people. But what do we find that goes on here? Obviously, God's going to bring judgment against them, but that's not really what we're looking for. I mean, it is going to happen, but what do we find much deeper than this? Just concerning God. They will not have authority over the Jews. What about God's sovereignty? What do we see about God's sovereignty here?
It's gonna go through.
Yeah. So, as I have planned, so shall it be. I used to work with a guy, and when a decision, he was my manager for a period of time, and when he would make a decision that we were going to follow through on, someone had to make, he would say, so let it be written, so let it be done. And you may have heard that quoted before, which is kind of a play off of this. Like God is saying, as I have planned, so shall it be. And this is the confidence and the authority of God being asserted. In other words, no one is going to thwart what I have and what I have said will happen. He goes on, as I have purposed, so shall it stand. Now, that word purpose is very interesting because God has a reason behind what he's doing. It's not just a whim that God says, this is going to happen, so it's just going to happen. He has a purpose behind it. And I think that's important for us to see too, that God is not just a God of reaction. He has purposes for what he does. And so he's saying here, as I've planned, as I've purposed, it will stand. I'll break the Assyrian in my land, on my mountains, trample him underfoot, and his yoke shall depart from them. In other words, they will no longer be able to oppress God's people of Judah. Any comment on that or question about it? All right, then question 11. Verses 24 through 27, we find God dealing with Assyria. They were a people that God permitted to discipline Judah, but what did he not allow the Assyrians to do? So let's read on down verse 26. We read 24, 25. Read verse 26. This is the purpose that is purposed concerning the whole earth, and this is the hand that is stretched out over all the nations. For the Lord of hosts has purposed, and who will annul it? His hand is stretched out, and who will turn it back? What and this is not really in the text necessarily, so it's just more of a history type thing. But when the Assyrians came in to try and conquer Judah, any idea what happened when they got to Jerusalem? Did God let them take Jerusalem? No, he stopped them there, and he actually destroyed the Assyrian army at that point, which is somewhat fulfillment of what he says in this 24 through 27, is that at some point the yoke of their oppression will end. And God prevented them. He allowed them to be a hand of judgment, permitted them to do that, but he did not let them overthrow and wipe out the remnant of people that God would have. So his judgment allowed them to go to a place, we talked about this earlier, that someone said it, I forgot who, that even Satan can only go so far. Like God has this, we call it a hedge of protection sometimes. He has this hedge of where God can go or where someone can go.
It was me.
It was you. You want credit for that? Is that what you're saying?
I don't get credit from you very often.
All right, question 12 then. What does verse 32 tell us? So let's read starting in verse 28 because that is dealing with the Philistines, Philistia. In the year that King Ahaz died, came this oracle, "Rejoice not, O Philistia, all of you, that the rod that struck you is broken. For from the serpent's root will come forth an adder, and its fruit will be a flying fiery serpent. The firstborn of the pool will graze, and the needy lie down in safety, but I will kill your root with famine, and your remnant it will slay. Wail, O gate, cry out, O city, melt in fear, O Philistia, all of you, for smoke comes out of the north, and there is no strangler in his ranks." What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her afflicted of his people find refuge. So you got to know a little bit of history as well with this to understand what's going on. So the Assyrians were enemies of the Philistia as well. Philistia and Syria did not get along. So when Assyria is destroyed, God is telling Philistia, don't rejoice because your time is coming. So in other words, don't get on your high horse and think that you've escaped everything and no longer do you have problems or no longer are you going to be oppressed or no longer is there anything going to be wrong. But he's saying, when you get down to verse 32, this is what I want us to grasp out of this. Verse 32, what are we seeing God say in this verse, not only to Philistia, but also to the people of Judah? Look at verse 32 again. What will one answer the messengers of the nation? The Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. Now, what does Zion commonly refer to?
Israel, the home,
Sorry?
the home of the Jews.
Yeah, Jerusalem, sometimes it's referred to as Jerusalem, but basically it's more of a concept. Now, for Isaiah, it was a place, Jerusalem, because God stopped the Assyrian army, did not let them destroy Jerusalem. He tells Philistia, you can find refuge in the people that are there because God has protected it. Now, when we think future, we can't think Jerusalem, location, city. We have to think concept. And so, do I? No. And so when we think of Zion, we think of God's people now, which is what Wesley had said, God's people, more of that concept. And so he says, within that, realize God has founded, and I'm going to use even maybe a more New Testament term, God has founded his church. And within his church, who the leader is Jesus Christ, then we find refuge. Only through the leader, Jesus Christ, and we will find that. So there is no, just because we may see an enemy be destroyed, think back through some of our years, and some of you might have been, maybe, probably not. I was thinking of time here. And
Better not go 18.
so when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, none of y'all were alive for that, right?
I wasn't very big.
So when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, and then when Japan was defeated, there may have been individuals that had excitement, yay, this is over, kind of thing. You think back more modern, recent times that my age can grasp, and that would be the Cold War. And some of you may remember doing the whole I forget what they called them now, but we had, in school we had to practice getting under our desk, nuclear attack kind of drill thing. When Reagan made those famous words, tear down the wall kind of thing, it was almost kind of a point of declaration that Cold War was kind of over. We could get really excited that like the enemy is gone kind of thing. You got North Korea that's raised his head in the last several years, or go back before that, Saddam Hussein that raised his head. Hussein's gone, and we can kind of get a little bit of excitement about that, you know, that he's gone. But there's still, like, the next enemy is there. Like, there's always, when one ends, there's always another that steps in and takes the place, right? So Hitler was one, then you got, you know, whoever after that, the progression of just.
Funny you bring that up, because Gorbachev died in the last day or so.
I saw that. But there's always the next enemy. So if we find comfort in an enemy being gone, then we're living in false hope, because the next enemy will rise. So the only place to find comfort then, when we look at verse 32, the Lord has founded Zion, and in her the afflicted of his people find refuge. Now I'm going to take the liberty to make that New Testament church, the leader of that being Jesus Christ, and in him we find refuge, not in the next enemy being gone. And we sometimes, even in our personal life, we think about, you know, the struggle that we're going on right now. That's past. We're done with that one. You think about raising kids, and what's that first milestone that parents kind of dread? Terrible twos. And they think when they turn 3, whew, it's over, right? But then what happens? The 3s are worse than the 2s, maybe. And then, you know, you get a little bit older and you hit that teenage stage. And then you get that stage where they think they know everything. And I mean, we all live through that to some degree, you know. But we think the next, you know, we think, okay, this is behind it. Well, it's not. Like, there's always going to be struggles. But our place of refuge is not in earthly things disappearing. The place of refuge is in Jesus Christ. And that's where we have to lean. So I would encourage you, if you're looking forward to the next problem in life just being gone, realize your joy is not coming in that. But your joy comes in leaning upon Christ. Would you pray with me this morning? Dear Heavenly Father, we come to you today. We do thank you for this day you've given us. And Lord, we're thankful for the promises that we see in your word and